Hong Kong is special by definition. It's a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China, and it's an ongoing political innovation. Westerners frequently referred to the handover of Hong Kong by the British to the Chinese in 1997. In Chinese, one never uses the term handover. It's always called the return of Hong Kong. What's the difference? You hand over your wallet to a mugger in a mugging. You return the wallet to the rightful owner after apprehending the mugger. Hong Kong has been a Chinese place since the Qin Empire united Imperial China more than 2,200 years ago. Hong Kong was on the edge, however, of the Chinese Empire. It was very briefly the capital of the Southern Song Empire, then Zhao Bing, the last Song emperor, retreating from the invading Mongols of the Yuan dynasty, was enthroned in present-day Mui Wo on Lantau Island. After the British defeated the Qing Dynasty in the First Opium War of 1839 to 1841, Hong Kong was given to the British by the Treaty of Nanking of 1842. The Treaty of Nanking was the first of many unequal treaties imposed by invading Westerners and Japanese that carved colonies, concessions, and cash from China. Republican China, after the Revolution of 1911, never recognized the legitimacy of those unequal treaties. Communist China, after the Revolution of 1949, never recognized the legitimacy of those unequal treaties. The Communists ended the foreign concessions in Shanghai and the other treaty ports, but Hong Kong remained under British control for about another half-century. Why? Hong Kong was militarily indefensible against the Japanese in World War II. It would have been militarily indefensible against the Communists in 1949, but the People's Liberation Army simply stopped at the rather unimpressive Shenzhen River that separates much of the new territories of Hong Kong from the town of Shenzhen. The Chinese government chose not to take over Hong Kong. It was a good deal for the British. They kept their administrators, their military bases, and their businesses. But it was also a good deal for the new Chinese government. Just 4 months after the declaration of the People's Republic of China, the UK, at that time the most powerful Western European power, recognized new China's legitimacy. That was 31 years before the UN recognized Beijing as the legitimate government of China, and 39 years before the US did. So China kept a window on the Western world. There its state-owned enterprises and its banks operated, making a conduit for foreign remittances for the Chinese diaspora and connecting to the payments platform for international trade. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, China was on the side of the North. The UK, the US, and the Western Allies imposed a trade embargo on China. But Hong Kong continued to serve as China's most porous non-Soviet border, both legally and, according to the terms of the embargo, illegally. China sold Hong Kong the water, food, and many products necessary for life in the colony, and China was instrumental in spurring Hong Kong's rapidly growing population. The population growth was not natural. Natural growth is births minus deaths. Hong Kong's growth has always been largely unnatural. Just look at this graph. Hong Kong had less than 10,000 people when the British took it in 1842. It had been a coastal outpost of the largely land-based empire of the Qing Dynasty. Hong Kong then was most famous for 2 things: producing incense, hence the name Incense Harbor or Xianggang, and harboring pirates, who often outgunned the Qing Dynasty in the South China Seas. However, once Hong Kong became a British colony, it was a connector of the largest maritime empire the world had ever seen with the largest current land empire of Asia. Hong Kong presented opportunity, attracting young, innovative persons, mainly from neighboring Guangdong province, as well as ambitious military, administrative, and business persons from the British Empire and its trading ports. The population swelled 30 times before the end of the century and quadrupled again before the outbreak of World War II. Japanese occupation in World War II ended that boom, as about 3/4 of Hong Kong's people left town. After the war, particularly after 1949, Hong Kong took its modern shape. Hong Kong became a home for Chinese refugees. The refugees overrepresented the losers of the Chinese Civil War. They came to escape conflict, to escape economic hardship, to escape political persecution, to escape wealth confiscation. The politically compromised, the industrialists, the traders, the religious, the intellectuals, the rightists, they were a not very cohesive anti-communist group. Modern, conservative, traditional, Anglophile, liberals, educated, entrepreneurial, Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist, Christian, pro-Western. For them, at least at first, Hong Kong was simply a way station, a borrowed place on borrowed time. They got on with their lives. The British maintained power, trained a competent civil service, and maintained a police force. In 1966 and 1967, radical leftists, inspired by the Cultural Revolution raging in China, led a movement against Hong Kong's mismanagement, corruption, and poverty. There were demonstrations, strikes, riots, bombings, assassinations, and a call for Chinese takeover. Scores of people died, hundreds were injured, and thousands were arrested. But after Premier Zhou Enlai ordered the radicals to stand down, the British were able to restore order. Many Hong Kongers emigrated, but the vast majority who stayed rode Hong Kong's rise to become a global metropolis. In the 1970s, Hong Kong, with South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, became one of the 4 tigers of Asia, rewriting the playbook of development. All 4 were Confucian-based societies. All 4 embraced macroeconomic stability, rule of law, well-regulated banking systems, strong and open educational policies, stable exchange rates, stimulation of exports, physical infrastructure development, massive public investment in housing, and the creation of industrial parks. Their social innovations were copied by China in the reform and opening period that started in 1978. China created the Special Economic Zones, the SEZs, for export processing. Located in Shantou and Xiamen, opposite Taiwan, in Zhuhai, opposite Macau, and in Shenzhen, opposite Hong Kong, the SEZs implemented many of the policies of the 4 tigers. They attracted capital, and they stimulated domestic industry. Innovations that had worked in the SEZs were then replicated in the rest of China. Shenzhen was the most successful SEZ. Hong Kong manufacturers at the time, facing rising labor costs at home, moved their factories north, often less than 100 kilometers. Many set up shop in the very places that they had left a generation before as refugees. Over the next 40 years, Hong Kong accounted for about 1/2 of the total foreign direct investment into China. In addition to capital, Hong Kongers brought business models, modes of thinking, and Hong Kong culture. Many found success, respect, power, and wealth. And Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong was returned to China. What kicked off the negotiations was actually a British problem: Hong Kong land titles. Although most of the populous parts of Hong Kong had been ceded in perpetuity to the British by the treaties of Nanking in 1842 and Tianjin in 1856, the largest portion of Hong Kong in terms of land area had been leased for 99 years by the Treaty of Extension of Hong Kong Territory in 1898. Hence, every piece of property in most of the area of Hong Kong under British law, would legally cease to have an effective title in 1997. When, in the early 1980s, the British raised this problem with the Chinese government simply said that they did not recognize the unequal treaties, and so there was no point in trying to solve the British problem. Instead, Hong Kong should be returned to China in 1997. The Joint Declaration, an international treaty to effect the return, was signed in 1984. The Joint Declaration did not make mention of the legal status of Hong Kong because the government of the UK and China disagreed about that legal status. The two parties simply agreed that a proper negotiated settlement of the question of Hong Kong, which is left over from the past, is conducive to the maintenance of the prosperity and stability of Hong Kong and to further strengthening and development of the relations between the two countries on a new basis. In that joint declaration, China stated its basic policies with respect to Hong Kong, including the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will enjoy a high degree of autonomy, except in foreign and defense affairs, which are the responsibilities of the Central People's Government. The joint declaration stated that Hong Kong law, upon return, would be subordinate to the National People's Congress in Beijing. In the joint declaration, the government of China declared the policies outlined in the joint declaration would be stipulated in a basic law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China by the National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China, and that they will remain unchanged for 50 years. That basic law, which is Hong Kong's mini-constitution, was duly passed by the Chinese National People's Congress on April 4th, 1990. And Hong Kong was duly returned on July 1st, 1997. Since 1997, Hong Kong has largely retained its legal and social system. Its economy has grown well, with annual per capita real GDP increasing from US dollars 35,000 at the return to US dollars 60,000 today. Yet good overall economic performance has not conferred high popularity on the Hong Kong government. Before the return, Hong Kong's governor was appointed by London. The basic law, echoing the joint declaration, said that after the return of Hong Kong, the chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region shall be selected by election or through consultations held locally and be appointed by the Central People's Government. The method for selecting the chief executive shall be specified in light of the actual situation in Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and in accordance with the principles of gradual and orderly progress. The ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon the nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Clearly, the two principles of selection, appointed by the Central People's Government, and universal suffrage in accordance with democratic procedures, could conflict. The method of election of the chief executive today remains one dominated by a 1,500-person-strong conservative electoral college where business interests are strongly represented. All four post-return chief executives of Hong Kong started their terms of office with approval ratings above 50%. All chief executives finished their terms with approval ratings below 50%. Hong Kongers tend to distrust the Central People's Government in Beijing. They see the chief executive, the leader of Hong Kong, as always trying to second-guess Beijing. In pre-return Hong Kong, the governor, appointed by London, looked first to London. Everybody understood that that was how he worked. But subservience to a foreign governor looking to his foreign capital has turned out to be less distasteful for Hong Kongers than a Hong Konger who claims to represent Hong Kong and yet looks first to Beijing. And then there is a problem of Hong Kong's role in a rising China. For the last half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st, many people in China agreed with most Hong Kongers that Hong Kong was superior to the rest of China. Hong Kong worked better, it was richer, cleaner, more efficient, more international. Now that's not so clear. China is on the path to global leadership. Coming from Hong Kong now means little in Shanghai and in Beijing. And that formerly sleepy village of Shenzhen is now larger in GDP, population, and area than Hong Kong itself. When Hong Kong was returned to China, Hong Kongers shared a genuine feeling of Chinese patriotism more than at any previous time in Hong Kong's history. Now, a quarter of a century later, the number of people identifying first as Hong Kongers rather than as Chinese has increased substantially. Many Hong Kongers fear being marginalized by an increasingly rich, assertive China. What if the special administrative region is no longer special? That's the fear. Moreover, Hong Kong has social problems, an increasing gap between the rich and the poor, the highest real estate prices in the entire world, and a dissatisfied youth who sees opportunities closing and lacks pride in the rise of China. The disturbances of 2019 were fed by this malaise. Demonstrations against a proposed law that allowed extradition of criminals to China evolved into a half-year-long movement against the government. The demonstrations were largely popular and peaceful, but they thrust to a forefront an anti-Chinese fringe of agitators who called for revolution, independence, and, at times, anarchy, and their calls made front-page news in the pre-pandemic world. Yet the disturbances appeared far more violent in the international press than they were in reality. Both the demonstrators and the police exercised restraint unimaginable in many parts of the world. No firearms were used by either the demonstrators or the police against the opposite side. Truncheons, helmets, shields, bricks, road signs, Molotov cocktails, tear gas, gas masks, water cannons, dye, knives, and even bows and arrows, but not guns, not bombs. There was no looting. The fire brigade, the ambulance service, and yes, the police operated largely professionally. Over 6 months of protests, only 2 people died in the protests. One rioter died when he fell from a building as he was trying to escape capture by the police. And a cleaner between the lines was killed by a brick that was thrown by demonstrators. That was it. 2 died. In the aftermath, Hong Kong has changed. Particularly, we now have a national security law. When Hong Kong was a colony of the United Kingdom, the UK law defined what was treason, what was sedition, and how one should achieve national security. But when Hong Kong ceased to be a colony of the United Kingdom, those UK laws also ceased. Beijing gave Hong Kong the task in the Basic Law, our mini-constitution, passed by the National People's Congress in 1990, the task to draft and enact Hong Kong's own security law. This was supposed to occur shortly after the return. But after the return, Hong Kong's legislature failed to pass a security law. Why? It was just too politically sensitive. The government of the first chief executive after the return, Dong Jianhua, tried to pass a national security law. Demonstrations erupted, his government essentially fell, and no one since tried to repeat his passage of a national security law. And so, when the disturbances of 2019 occurred, there was an incomplete legal framework to deal with them. The burning and incitement to riot were illegal and could be prosecuted, but the calls for revolution were not covered by any laws. Yet a country that is to survive must define what constitutes sedition. And the government of the People's Republic of China is committed to doing far more than just surviving. The National People's Congress Standing Committee directly passed Hong Kong's security law. In its wake, much of the political party structure and some of the media of Hong Kong have been dismantled. The national anthem plays every day in the evening on TV. Civics is being taught in schools. The central government is keen that national security be maintained. Hong Kongers have a tradition of mobility. Many now seriously are considering moving to the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. Emigration could easily reach 1% per year in the very near future. But this is not new. Emigration reached that proportion of the population after the 1960s riots and in the early 1990s. But opportunity continues to beckon people to Hong Kong. The city imports unskilled and skilled labor. It pulls at the Hong Kong diaspora, looking back to their vibrant old home from their possibly less exciting new ones. It attracts professionals globally, and most important, as Hong Kong integrates into the 70 million strong Greater Bay Area, it continues to draw the young and talented from the rest of China. But Beijing is also keen to promote innovation for the stability and growing prosperity of the special administrative region. Hong Kong remains a cosmopolitan society with a highly educated populace, an open economy, a well-functioning independent judiciary, universal health care, and a high degree of social cohesion. Hong Kong presents opportunity. The Hong Kong story continues.